Daniel Jocelyn Smatowski. I am the director of the Center for Christian Jewish Learning and the Kraft Family Professor here at Boston College. And it's my pleasure to welcome you all to our lecture featuring this year's Corcoran Chair in Christian Jewish Relations, Dr. Dror Bondi. He'll be speaking on the topic of Heschel on Israel. So please let me introduce Dr. Bondi to you. He is the Senior Research Fellow and Lecturer at the Schechter Institute in Jerusalem and the 2025 to 2027 Corcoran Visiting Chair here at our center. He completed his PhD and MA in Jewish philosophy at Bar Ilan University. He is an author, translator, and editor of several of Abraham Joshua Heschel's books in Hebrew. Dr. Bondi's book, Ayecha, about Heschel's thought, earned him the 2006 Shalem Prize. In 2019, his edition of Heschel's groundbreaking Torah Min HaShemayim, or Torah from Heaven, won the Mafal HaPais Prize. And we have a respondent for this evening, Dr. Susanna Heschel, and please let me introduce her as well. She is the Eli M. Black Distinguished Professor and Chair of Jewish Studies at Dartmouth College. She is the author of many books, including The Aryan Jesus, Christian Theologians, and the Bible in Nazi Germany, and most recently, Jewish Studies and the Woman Question, written with Sarah Imhoff. To her credit are also numerous edited books and articles, including 2 volumes of her father's writings, Moral Grandeur and Spiritual Audacity, and the essential writings of Abraham Joshua Heschel. She is also the executor of his literary estate. Dr. Heschel is a Guggenheim Fellow, a Fellow of the Wissenschaftskolleg zu Berlin, and has held grants from the Carnegie Corporation and the Rockefeller and Ford Foundations. She's received 5 honorary doctorates from universities in the United States, Canada, Germany, and Switzerland. Dr. Heschel has been a visiting professor at numerous institutions, and this year she is the Gerard Weinstock Visiting Professor in Jewish Studies at Harvard University. And she is also an important supporter and friend of the Center for Christian Jewish Relations. Dr. Bondi will now deliver his lecture, then we'll have Dr. Heschel respond, and after that, we will take time for questions. Dror, please.
Thank you, Dan. I would like to open by expressing my gratitude to the Center for Christian Jewish Learning, especially to you, for the opportunity to devote my time to the study of Heschel's thought. And thank you, Susanna. Your presence is so important for me. And thank you all for braving the snow. Let's start. Shalom. Abraham Joshua Heschel was the most deeply engaged Jewish thinker of the 20th century. In his thought, he sought to make present God's concern for all human beings, and he followed that way himself. He marched alongside Martin Luther King Jr. for civil rights, played a significant role in the process that led to Nostra Aetate, and was a leading voice in interreligious protest against the Vietnam War. In this context, a question naturally arises. What was Heschel's relationship to Zionism and to the State of Israel? A common approach in Heschel scholarship, as well as in public discussion, tends to read his thought as a unified whole. Since the publication of Israel, an Echo of Eternity in 1969, which articulated a version of spiritual Zionism, there has been a tendency to interpret Heschel's earlier writings through this later lens. Yet, such reading obscures an earlier and more complex thought. In this sense, our opening slide is misleading. Reflects Heschel of the 60s, not his early writings. In this lecture, I will argue that until 1957, when Heschel first visited the State of Israel, he adopted a markedly critical stance towards Zionism to the point of avoiding any mention of the state in his works. He was not anti-Zionist and didn't write against the state. Rather, he resisted identifying Israel with the state. Thus, during the first half of the 50s, he conducted a subtle but persistent struggle over the very meaning of the term Israel, seeking to reclaim it within a diasporic Jewish theology. His concern was not primarily political, but spiritual and identity-oriented. As I will show, this interpretation of the term responded both to the Zionist interpretation and to the Christian interpretation of the term, and in a certain sense created a third possibility between them. Of course, both Zionism and Christianity include a wide range of positions. What matters for our purposes here, however, is how Heschel understood them at that time. With regard to Christianity, this was of course prior to the dramatic shift marked by Nostra Aetate in 1965. With regard to Zionism, it appears that for Heschel, it was not merely a movement of geographical return or political sovereignty, but a project of identity formation. It rested on the assumption that Jews constitute a nation in the European sense of the term, defined by origin, territory, and language, and therefore entitled to national self-determination through a nation-state. In Heschel's view, this marked a profound shift in Jewish self-understanding, and the naming of the state as Israel represented an unjustified claim to a theological term. Let's start from the end of that period. In 1955, 7 years after the establishment of the State of Israel, Heschel published his major work, God in Search of Man, A Philosophy of Judaism. There is an obvious tension between its universal title, Man, and its particularistic subtitle, Judaism, yet it is striking that a book bearing such a subtitle entirely avoids mentioning the State of Israel by name. Only few words apply to it in the last 2 pages. What we have witnessed in our own days. A brief remark that appears as if added at the last minute. Even the term Land of Israel, discussed briefly only in these last pages of Heschel's Philosophy of Judaism. A Zionist reader may be astonished at this book. The term Israel appears in it more than 200 times, yet never as the name of the state. Moreover, for Heschel, Israel is not only a name of a people which one may understand as an ethnic phenomenon that deserves a national self-determination. Rather, Israel is described as a spiritual order, even as a partner of God. For example, Israel remains the mate of God, and God was alone in the world until Israel became engaged to him. Absence by itself proves nothing, yet in the historical context of the 50s, it was a resounding silence. Today, the word Israel is immediately associated with the state, to the point that even the people of Israel often refers to its citizens rather to the Jewish people wherever it lives. Yet, the decision to give the state this name was far from self-evident. When Ben-Gurion read the Declaration of Independence on May 14, 1948, he declared the Jewish state to be called Israel. Yet, only 4 days earlier, the final draft still left the state's name blank. The name Israel was approved only at the last moment, narrowly defeating alternatives such as Zion and Judea, and immediately provoked controversy among Jews and Christians alike. For example, the American Jewish historian Simon Ravidovich warned Ben-Gurion in a series of letters that naming the state Israel would marginalize diaspora Jews. Ben-Gurion replied that this was precisely his Zionist intention. Only in the state of Israel could a healthy Judaism exist. The source of the Christian reaction was theological or supersessionist, since Christianity had long used the name Israel to describe itself as the only universal community of salvation. For example, 2 weeks after the establishment of the state, the Catholic journal Commonweal protested that, as Catholics, Israel's arrogation of a universal name for so local an habitation must distress us. The Holy See itself avoided using the term Israel for decades, even in Nostra Aetate. The formal change came only in 1985 with Pope John Paul II, when due to his instruction, the Church named and discussed the state of Israel. From the other side, religious Zionists used Christian opposition to the name of the state as evidence for their religious justification of Zionism. For example, Rabbi Soloveitchik remarked in his first Zionist speech in 1956 that Christians, despite themselves, must mention the name of Israel when they report the news. It is precisely within this charged and multivocal controversy that Heschel's silence must be situated. At the very moment when the term Israel became a site of debate between diasporic Jews, Christian theologians, and Zionist leaders, Heschel consistently avoided using the term as the name of the state. Still, one cannot infer Heschel's attitude toward Zionism from silence alone. To understand the deeper logic of his approach, we must briefly turn to his writings before 1948. In many respects, Zionism was a response to European anti-Semitism, which culminated in the Holocaust. For that very reason, Heschel's early reflections on Jewish history and exile are especially revealing. A striking example appears in the final paragraph of his biography of Abarbanel, a rabbi and royal advisor expelled from Spain in 1492, published in Frankfurt in 1937. The Jews, who had held imposing positions in the state, left their Spanish homeland. Had they remained, they most probably would have taken part in the enterprises of the conquistadors. The desperate Jews of 1492 could not know that a favor had been done them. Heschel asks here a disturbing question. Had Abarbanel remained in Spain, might he have taken part in the conquest of the New World and its atrocities? Writing in Germany as fascism was rising, Heschel hinted by this historical reflection as a warning for his own time. Exiled from Germany, he couldn't yet imagine the Holocaust, might spare Jews from becoming implicated in the crimes of their homeland. The point is decisive for his thought. The challenge of Judaism is not only about protecting Jewish victims, its deeper responsibility is to offer moral inspiration so we do not become agents of evil. Indeed, in his 1943 essay, The Meaning of This War, Heschel made his universal mission explicit. Evoking a Hasidic parable, he describes travelers trapped in a pit of snakes. While others fight the snakes, one seeks a way out for everyone. Heschel explained, in sharp contrast to the dominant Zionist response to the Holocaust, that tanks and plans cannot redeem humanity. The killing of snakes will save us for a moment, but not forever. The greatest task of our time is to take the souls of man out of the pit. However, during this period, there is one notable positive statement by Heschel about Zionism. Only one word. It appears at the end of his address to the EVO conference in 1945, a eulogy for the destruction of the Eastern European Jewry. Precisely in this eulogistic context, Heschel sought to vindicate Zionism, as well as other secular movements. This is not Heschel's settled position, a moment of eulogy rather than theology. In 1950, Heschel published an expanded version of the essay, As the Earth is the Lord's, briefly and positively mentioning the rebuilding of Israel. Some have read this as a reference to the newly founded state, yet the booklet never uses the term state, and the phrase may just as well refer to the land. Moreover, biographical and draft evidence suggests that this isolated usage may reflect editorial pressure rather than Heschel's own intention. Close reading of the draft shows that the word Eretz, the land of, was deleted before Israel. Unlike most of Heschel's own deletions, this change appears in bold ink with a check mark above it. You see it? Suggesting Heschel's reluctant assent to the editor's deletion. Moreover, Heschel's critique of Zionism and its doctrine of the negation of the diaspora appears at the very opening of the first chapter through a sharp contrast between time and space, a theme he developed poetically in the Sabbath a year later. By opposing holiness in space to holiness in time, Heschel implicitly challenged the land-centered nationalism of Zionism. Let us turn to further examples from the early 50s. Here is an example from Man is Not Alone, published in 1951. While the historian explains the suffering of Israel in terms of the political geography of Palestine, the prophet speaks of a divine plan to let Israel be afflicted in order to atone, not for its own sins, but for the sins of the heathen. Here Heschel contrasts a historical geopolitical view of Israel, akin to Zionist self-understanding, with the prophetic image of Israel as the servant of the Lord. The Isaianic theme of vicarious suffering applied to the people rather than an individual subtly engaged Christian theology like the Jewish medieval tradition. Thus, without referring explicitly either to Zionism or to Christianity, Heschel implicitly reclaims the term Israel from both. With respect to the universal meaning of the term, he sides with Christianity against Zionism. With respect to its referent, he sides with Zionism against Christianity. Another key text from those years is The Moment at Sinai, published in 1953. Although it appeared in a Zionist journal, the essay challenges the claim that Jews return to history only through sovereignty. Against the Zionist view that the diasporic Jews existed outside of history, Heschel explains that Jewish history begins at Sinai, where a perpetual covenant was forged between God and all generations of Israel. Sustained by the memory of revelation and the hope for the Messianic age, this history is shaped not by power, territory, or sovereignty, but by ongoing responsiveness to the divine pathos within sanctified time. I cannot survey here all of Heschel's critics of Zionism in the early 50s. Instead, I will focus on a genealogy of 3 essays that formed the basis of the final chapter of God in Search of Man, the people Israel. The sequence begins with the 1947 Yiddish essay, Der Sinnen von Yiddischen Kiyum, continues with its 1949 Hebrew reworking, Pikuach Neshama, and culminates in the 1951 article, To Be a Jew, What Is It? A clear engagement with our topic is already evident from all these titles. The translation of the Yiddish title is The Meaning of Jewish Existence. The Hebrew hints that the challenge is not only the saving of life as the halachic concept of pikuach nefesh, but the saving of the deeper meaning of the soul, pikuach neshama. In both the Yiddish and Hebrew essays, Heschel emphasizes that being a Jew is not an innate trait, it must be acquired through the spirit of Judaism. To be human requires responsiveness toward God and the other, and the same applies to a people. In Heschel's words, Judaism teaches us that to remain a people, we must be more than a people. In the Hebrew version, Heschel sharpens the point with a striking warning, which may be read against mere national identity. A Jew who forgets his nobility, there is no greater transgression than this. Comparison of the Yiddish and Hebrew versions reveals a polemical shift. Throughout the Hebrew version, Heschel replaced many occurrences of the Yiddish word Eden, Jews, with the Hebrew word Israel, and added many new occurrences of the term. Though the state had just established, Israel here doesn't refer to it, but conveys a spiritual theological understanding of the Jewish people. One might argue that the shift from Jews to Israel was merely stylistic, reflecting the move from Yiddish to Hebrew. Yet, the historical and textual context, together with Heschel's later writings, point to a deliberate and theologically meaningful choice. Let us consider 2 examples. In the Hebrew version, Heschel asks about the source of Jewish joy, crucial question in the aftermath of the Holocaust. But instead of pointing to the miracle of the new state, he explains, the life of Israel is stretched between 2 historical poles, the Exodus from Egypt and the Messianic kingdom. Sentence which replaces a neutral one in the Yiddish version, which doesn't use the term Israel and Messianic. It is important to note that this is not a Messianic reading of the establishment of the State of Israel. On the contrary, Heschel argues that for Israel, not the state, but the spiritual theological people, just as the Exodus remains an enduring point of departure, so too the Messianic kingdom remains a constant point of aspiration. The political state, which claims to have returned to history, is not the source of Israel's joy. Rather, Israel awaits redemption by God at the end of history. Another example. Heschel concludes his essay by clarifying the motivation behind his Ahavat Israel, namely, love of Israel, the people. There can be no love of Israel if we don't walk with the generations that produce us, and vice versa. Without love for the Jews of our time, we will not succeed in connecting with the Israel of the past. the very qualification of love of Israel in relation to past generations is a sharp claim, one that becomes even more pronounced in light of the linguistic choice. A somewhat forced expression, Israel of the past, replaces the simpler reference to the Jews in the original Yiddish version, while the reference to the Jews of Heschel's own time is retained. This shift illustrates Heschel's tendency to employ the term Israel more frequently and in a sense distinct from that of the newly founded state. The English essay, To Be a Jew, makes Heschel's approach much clearer. At the very outset, he employs the term Israel in a sense entirely different from that of a nation-state. The meaning of Jewish existence is baffling. To fit it into the framework of personal intellectual predilections, of current fashions of our time, would be a distortion. The claim of Israel must be recognized before attempting an interpretation. We have not invented it, we may accept or reject, but shouldn't distort it. In this context, the claim of Israel refers not to a political demand concerning the land, but to a moral spiritual claim embodied in the term Israel. Why did Heschel, in 1951, feel that the fashions of our time distort the meaning of Israel? Might he have had also nationalism in mind? To make clear that he doesn't advocate a vague universal spiritualism, Heschel immediately adds that this claim is entirely contingent upon the lived reality of a specific community. In this moment, we, the living, are Israel. The task begun by the patriarchs and prophets are now entrusted to us. Here, we refers to the Jewish people as a whole, and especially to the Jews living in the diaspora, where Heschel wrote. In other words, neither a political entity, such as the newly founded state, nor a universal entity such as the church, bears witness to Israel, the faithful community. Heschel brings his spiritual theological discourse to its full expression in paragraphs newly added to this version, absent from the previous ones. Israel, he wrote, is a spiritual order in which the human and the ultimate, the natural and the holy, enter a lasting covenant. I have faith in God and faith in Israel. Though some of its children have gone astray, Israel remains the mate of God. Later in the English essay, Heschel explains an implication of this image. He rejects the idea that Jewish survival rests on sovereignty or demands unconditional national loyalty. Survival, he argues, means faithfulness to a divine vocation. Israel exists not merely to live, but to carry God's dream into history. Heschel's approach comes into sharper focus when contrasted with Rabbi Soloveitchik's post-Holocaust Zionist theology, which grounds Jewish meaning in collective national faith. Heschel instead was not a religious Zionist who accepts the definition of Judaism as a nation and then seeks to sanctify it or build a religious layer upon it. He affirms a covenantal spiritual order that transcends political survival and points toward universal redemption. Final two additions to the English essay, a sudden biblical episode, followed by a brief reflection on the meaning of the chosen people, introduce a radical theological climax. The biblical episode recalls the aftermath of the sin of the golden calf. God first threatened to annihilate Israel, yet after Moses convinced him to let the people reach the promised land, God proposed that they go there without him, accompanied instead by an angel. Moses replied in Heschel's quotation, "If thou thyself dost not go with us, take us not out of the wilderness." This perhaps is the secret of our history, to choose to remain in the wilderness rather than to be abandoned by him. What then is Heschel's intention in invoking this story? What difference would it make whether Israel entered the land with God himself or merely with his angel? Moses understood that God's proposal implied that Israel was to become a nation like all other nations, guided by a local divine power rather than by the creator of the world. Yet, the very meaning of the name Israel is the opposite. Jacob was granted this name after wrestling with the angel and prevailing, that is, after transcending belief in local gods and directing his faith solely toward the universal God. Heschel therefore sides with Moses, arguing that European-style nationalism had become a new golden calf. Zionism, he implies, chose to go forward with an angel, that is, with an ethnic and political identity, whereas Heschel himself, like Moses, preferred to remain in the wilderness with God, even at the cost of exile. After this elusive phrasing, Heschel proceeds to clarify the meaning of the chosen people. I quote the passage as it appears in God in Search of Man. Israel's experience of God has not evolved from search. We have not chosen God. He has chosen us. There is no concept of a chosen God, but there is the idea of a chosen people. The idea of a chosen people does not suggest the preference for a people based upon a discrimination among a number of peoples. We do not say that we are a superior people. The chosen people means a people approached and chosen by God. The significance of this term is genuine in relation to God rather than in relation to other peoples. It signifies not a quality inherent in the people, but a relationship between the people and God. Let me explain. To choose has two distinct meanings. We may choose an object for its usefulness, or choose a person out of love. The first is instrumental. The second creates a relationship of mutual empathy. I care for your feelings. In this sense, choosing is not based on qualities or comparison, but is constituted by the relationship itself. Accordingly, there are two different and even opposing meanings of the chosen people. In the first, a group chosen by God, whether Israel or the church, is preferred because of racial or theological characteristics, implying superiority. In the second, chosenness denotes an act of mutual love between God and a particular people, independent of such traits, and calling for commitment to God's universal perspective. Hence, Israel cannot denote a state founded by an ethnic group seeking self-realization and survival, nor can it embody the supersessionist struggle which identifies God with itself. These are distortions of the term's meaning that in Heschel's view at the time amount to historical plagiarisms he couldn't accept. Due to time constraints, I cannot explore further examples and nuances. I will therefore conclude by briefly noting two shifts in Heschel thought in 1957, which may also be connected to his friendship with Reinhold Niebuhr, recently analyzed in a comprehensive study by Professor Susanna Heschel. In 1957, a significant interreligious encounter, among the first of its kind, took place between the faculties of the Jewish Seminary and the Christian College, where Heschel and Niebuhr taught. At this meeting, Niebuhr delivered an important address calling for interreligious pluralism, in which he also emphasized the importance of legitimizing the State of Israel. That same year, two parallel changes became visible in Heschel's own thought. During his first visit to Israel, he delivered a speech expressing support for the state and proposed a compromise in the dispute over the meaning of the term Israel. We succeeded in establishing the State of Israel. The time has come to establish the House of Israel. The State of Israel is in the Holy Land. The House of Israel is to be found wherever Jews have settled, house whose windows are open toward the land of Israel. Rather than struggling over who the true Israel is, the Jews of the new state or the Jews of the diaspora, Heschel here suggests viewing these two communities as distinct expressions of Israel. He doesn't abandon this understanding of the term, but he acknowledges the reality of the state as a living interpretation of it, alongside the right of diaspora Jews to sustain their connection to the term through the notion of the House of Israel. In this light, perhaps the Jewish state shouldn't be called simply Israel, as if it alone embodied Israel, but rather the State of Israel. State meant to express the spirit of Israel. A vision Heschel would articulate more fully in his later work. The second shift appears in his essay, The Secret Image of Man, which concludes with passages drawn from drafts of the prophets. In these passages, Heschel formulates for the first time the idea of multiple chosen peoples, based on an interpretation of Isaiah 19. In that day, Israel shall be a third with Egypt and Assyria, a blessing in the midst of the earth, which the Lord of hosts has blessed, saying, Blessed be my people, Egypt, and Assyria, the work of my hands, and Israel, my inheritance. They will live together when they will worship together. All three will be equally God's chosen people. Heschel arrives here at a new insight. Already in God in Search of Man, he had redefined chosen as a relationship with God rather than as metaphysical fact. Now it takes a further and necessary step toward an interreligious horizon. This relationship between God and Israel can, and according to Isaiah, ultimately will, exist side by side with Assyria and Egypt. Let me conclude. Heschel did not oppose the state of Israel, nor the retreat into a nostalgic vision of exile. What concerned him was not politics as such, but the meaning of Israel. He insisted that the term names a covenantal relationship between a people and the universal God who created all human beings in his likeness. Israel is a partner of God that cannot be reduced to territory, power, or mere survival. In the early 50s, this insistence placed him between national Zionism and universal Christianity. In the 60s, he offered both of them a vision of solidarity and dialogue grounded in the responsiveness of siblings to their common parent. Heschel could make this change, for the question he never abandoned was not where Jews live or what best ensures their survival, but how Israel bears God's moral dream in history. That question, I would suggest, remains unresolved, and therefore still urgent today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for a wonderful lecture and for all of the work, Dror Bondi, that you have done to bring my father's writings to the people of Israel and around the world. I thank you for the translations and even more for the teaching that you do, the lectures that you give. I appreciate it because you have a feeling for my father, and that's not always the case, and I appreciate it. I appreciate that you understand and you are sensitive to what he's trying to accomplish. And I want to thank Dan and Ruth for inviting me today. I'm your neighbor down the road, as you know, and I love to come to Boston College, and I love what you do here. Thank you. And thank you, Dror, for asking me to respond to your paper, which I've enjoyed very much. And I'll just let everybody know that there'll be a longer article that will appear, so you can read even more. So how do I want to respond? I want to make a suggestion. First of all, I'm a historian. So what's important to a historian is context. And I want to suggest a few ways to contextualize some of the points that you're making in your talk. First of all, I want to contextualize this era from the end of World War II, 1945, until the time just before 1967, which is the part you're talking about. And then I also want to contextualize in another way, which is my father's own religious context, and including his family and how he thinks, yeah? And then finally, I want to say a little bit about what happened after the period that you know very well, but maybe not everybody here does. That is, after 67, what my father was saying. So first of all, I would say that we must think about what it was like to be a Jew in the United States in the 1950s. It's a Cold War. There's an anxiety about dual allegiance, dual loyalty. You may remember the famous Rosenberg case when two husband and wife were put to death, executed for supposedly treasonous activities for the Soviet Union. It was an anxious time, and Jews were trying to rebuild themselves, and I don't just mean physically, but spiritually, after the Holocaust. I also want to point out that in this period, it was assumed, even by Zionist leaders, even by the Prime Minister of Israel, David Ben Gurion, that Jews have to be loyal to the country where they are living. He told this to Jacob Blaustein, the president of the American Jewish Committee. Ben Gurion himself points this out. There's a way also in which Jews look at what's happening in Israel, certainly as a place of refuge. But what do they see? For many Jews in the 1950s, they're seeing in Israel secular kibbutzim, where there's an anti-religious environment. There are people, Jews in these kibbutzim, making barbecues on Yom Kippur. There is an anti-religious element that is assumed, as well as a political element that was very disturbing to quite a few people. I want to point out also that during this period, you mentioned Reinhold Niebuhr coming from the Union Theological Seminary, the Protestant Seminary, to the Jewish Theological Seminary, where my father taught in 1957. And we have to remember that in the 1940s and 50s, it was forbidden by the Chancellor, Louis Finkelstein, at the Jewish Theological Seminary, forbidden to sing Hatikva at their graduation ceremony. Zionism was not something that was part of Jewish life in the 50s. There was, if anything, an ambivalence, let's say, if not a full-blown anti-Zionist movement like the American Council for Judaism, Zionism in the US had been in the hands of Reform rabbis. Where does that leave religious Jews like my father? There's a wonderful new book by Adam Furtziger from Bar-Ilan University called Agents of Change, in which he describes a visit by Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion in 1960 to Yeshiva University, Orthodox university and rabbinical school in New York City. He's introduced by the president, Samuel Belkin, who spoke in Hebrew but with an Ashkenazi accent. In other words, not the way an Israeli speaks Hebrew, but in a kind of very old-fashioned. And he said, quote, "One could not be an upstanding religious Jew without a deep appreciation for the land of Israel." Notice that he says land of Israel, not state of Israel. That is how it was spoken of in those days. And then Prime Minister Ben-Gurion talked to the students and the enthusiastic audience, 1,000 people were there. He talked about the challenges facing the state of Israel, including the military challenges, the dangers, physical dangers. And Ben-Gurion cited a psalm. Hine lo yanum v'lo yishan shomer Yisrael. Behold, God who guards Israel, neither slumbers nor sleeps. The one who guards Israel, neither slumbers nor sleeps. And at that point, someone in this audience at Yeshiva University shouted out, "Mr. Prime Minister, to which guard are you referring? To the Israel Defense Force or to the Kadosh Baruch Hu, to God?" There was some chuckling and some dismay to hear that question. But you see, there was a sense, is this Zionism, is this state a religious state? Or a non-religious, even an anti-religious? Some queasiness among religious Jews. Now, I want to then point out something in personal terms. Certainly, Israel was a place of refuge, and there's no question about it. But I want to tell you that my father came, as you well know, of course, from a very deeply religious family, a Hasidic family. Hasidism is a pietistic movement. And it was my father's family that was part of the effort to establish an international organization of what are called ultra-Orthodox Haredi Jews, Agudas Yisrael. My father's brother in Vienna was married to the daughter of the Chertkover Rebbe, who was one of the most active in creating Agudas Yisrael, an anti-Zionist organization. I might point out also that the Lubavitcher Rebbe before the more recent one, so until 1951, was adamantly anti-Zionist. Adamantly. My uncle, the Kapitchnitzer Rebbe, who got out of Vienna and was in New York, was very close to the Satmar Rebbe, who was also very much opposed to Zionism. Why were they opposed? I think most of us know they were opposed because one has to wait for the Messiah to come and not take messianism into human hands. Zionism was seen as a secular, anti-religious movement. Zionism was trying to do something political and define Jews, as you had pointed out in your talk, as an ethnic national group rather than a religious community. So for all these many reasons, this is the world out of which my father emerged. And I might also just add that the head of Agudas Yisrael, who just passed away during COVID, was my cousin. My grandmother and his grandfather were twins. That's the family. So I think I would adjust a little bit here. I would say, to whom is my father speaking? For whom is he writing? Whom is he addressing? He is imbued with that Haredi world, and I would say that my father is, in fact, a Haredi thinker who might have written what he wrote, not in English, but in Hebrew as a Torah commentary. You know, the Oyev Yisrael didn't write a commentary to the prophets. My father did. And his words in every sentence, every paragraph, are expressing Hasidic thoughts. And that's the way to understand. So I think that's what he's addressing. And in addition, he's addressing, of course, the anti, or at least queasiness of American Jews and trying to find some kind of middle path, perhaps, to make the Haredi community a little more sensitive to what Zionism could be, to have a religious Zionism, perhaps, and for the anti-Zionists, of course, to try to understand what it means to be a religious Jew. Let's point out, and I would say here, there's one point where I would disagree with you. I don't think that this is about my father trying to respond somehow to Christianity. That one article, which I thought actually was very funny, I'm glad you put it up, from the Commonweal magazine, and I took a note where it says, Israel's arrogation of universalism for so local a habitation must distress us. And yet it says, a few lines later, Israel is the whole redeemed world, the world of the incarnation of Christianity. So who's arrogating for universal purposes, of course, but that is an aside. I don't think it's the Christian, actually, that is concerned to my father. I would say rather that he's trying to ask if it can be possible for a religious Jew to be a Zionist, and how. How to find religious meaning in the state. How to find that. And I would say that those ideas are actually very Jewish ideas, whether it's the suffering servant that you mentioned, for example, or if it's the idea that we have to be in exile, because in Hasidic terms, exile is within us. It's an existential state. And in fact, we need to be in exile to prepare for the Messiah. How does one prepare for the coming of the Messiah? And so in that sense, I would say when you write the word reclaim, that my father's reclaiming something from Christianity, I would say no, he's retaining classic Jewish ideas. I also would just point out that on the Christian side, there is no, of course, Christianity as such. There are many different Christianities and different understandings and approaches, so one has to be careful there. I would also point out that Reinhold Niebuhr didn't start his love for Zionism and commitment to Zionism in 1957, but rather in 1929. Reinhold Niebuhr, one of the most important public intellectuals in the United States, a great Protestant thinker and ethicist of the 20th century, in 1929 thought that Zionism was an answer to the question of Jewish belonging and survival. He was the chief spokesman for the American Christian Palestine Committee and of the Christian Council for Palestine, Zionist organizations. And he continued that commitment through the war years, and so, by the way, did his wife in his name after his death. So, I would say finally, what happens after this period? Yes, my father spoke at conferences and gave lectures to all kinds of different groups. One of the things that he always did was to tell people what they didn't want to hear. He would come in with a challenge, with a criticism. He would tell the rabbis of the Reform movement, you need more halakha, more Jewish observance. And he would tell some of the other rabbis, well, you need to have a little more theology or not. He told them what my mother would say to him, please, tone it down, they're going to get upset. And indeed, they did often get upset. But it was that kind of tochacha, that kind of scolding that one expects from a rabbi and from a Hasidic Rebbe. And my father was a Hasidic Rebbe. And when he went to Israel, he also scolded. He said, Israel can also be seen as still in galut, in exile. How does Israel celebrate Independence Day with jet planes and tanks in the streets? That's not the way to be. That's not Jewish. Jews in Israel sometimes are forgetting what it is to be a Jew, with all of their anti-religion, negation of the diaspora. So he scolded, but he also emphasized something else. And I want to just read you a few lines from his book, Israel, an Echo of Eternity, which he wrote after 67. It started in the months after with an essay on Jerusalem, and then it continued to a book. He said, Jerusalem is not sacred in itself as land. He said, we do not worship the soil, but rather it's endowed with the power to inspire moments in which God's presence is palpable to us. For God to be present, there must be witnesses. And to enter Jerusalem today, he writes, we're not alone. We're accompanied by streams of endless craving, clinging, dreaming, flowing day and night. Because in Jerusalem, the Psalms inhabit the hills. The air is hallelujah. It's an experience to be in Israel, and it's a reminder. Israel is a hope, a dream, an article of faith that lived in the hearts of Jews for all ages. But always my father brought a challenge. It's not enough to go to Israel. No. How do you live in the city of God, he asks. How does one enter such a place? How do you prepare to go to Israel, to go to Jerusalem, to be attuned to hear those psalms that the hills are singing? This is a duty. And, he added, a warning. We can't just live in the political realm. Because power, he says, can become demonic when detached from moral meaning and from moral commitment. Statement that I think is very important for us to this very day. The site, the place, the makom, Israel, keeping in mind, by the way, that the word for place in Hebrew, makom, is one of the names of God. This land is the place where holiness can be created. And the question is, how do we do that? Because for my father, holiness is not something that comes to us, but that which engages us. How do we create holy moments? How do we make ourselves able to be aware to God's presence? That's the challenge. And when we speak of the interdependence, of the chosenness of the relationship, it's a relationship that comes with that demand. How to live in the city of God, how to live in the presence of God in this place. Those are his questions and his challenges, and I think they're important to all of us to this day, both Jews and Christians. Thank you.
Thank you to Dror and thank you to Susanna. Those were both really excellent lecture and response. I think really gives us a real depth of understanding of not just Abraham Joshua Heschel's understanding of Israel and Zionism, but opens up to this bigger conversation about the meanings of these ideas for today as well. So the floor is open to questions from the audience. My colleague Camille Markey is in the back with a handheld microphone. If there's any initial takers, please, Guy Biner.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I'm just wondering, after the dialogue of the response, the paper and the response, what in the end then makes Heschel's commentary unique? On the one hand, if he's been contextualized historically, then it would seem that this would be a norm, but that's not the notion I got from the paper. He didn't choose, clearly in his critique, to follow the path of Orthodox Zionism, of Rabbi Kook, right? That's the path he just decided not to take. And he didn't quite go with this more Orthodox Haredi approach, where the critique is the trikat haketz, that he's pushing the Messiah, pushing the Messiah. And by putting this notion, by questioning the notion of appropriation of this universal term of Israel, were there other people that adhere to that? Is it a sole voice, or is this a communal voice? Because the response of Professor Heschel here is that this was kind of normal. This is the dilemma that American Jews were going through. And yet, it doesn't seem quite normal. It seems to be a sole voice which he's expressing, and people have to come to terms with it, but it's unique because other people did feel comfortable to use at an early stage the term Israel in referring to the state. They didn't necessarily question this appropriation.
I think that Heschel's uniqueness is in the understanding what is the meaning of being a Jew. For example, there was a dispute between him and Mordechai Kaplan in the end of the 50s. The topic of the dispute was whether the conservative movement should join the Zionist movement. Kaplan said, to be a Jew is an ethnic phenomenon. Judaism is civilization. And there is no future for the Jews in the US without Zionism. But Heschel, even though in 1959 he supported Zionism, said that the conservative movement shouldn't join the Zionist organization because Zionism is a political movement and Judaism is a spiritual, moral, religious entity. So I think this was Heschel's uniqueness. The ultra-Orthodox understood Judaism as a religion, which defined by Jewish law. For Heschel, Judaism was, as I said, a spiritual, theological essence. And I think it was unique there, and it is unique today. And I think it is an example for diaspora Jews today. You give so much support to Israel, to the state of Israel, but mainly material support. But the main problem of the state of Israel today is lack of vision. And I think this is the responsibility of the American Jewry and diaspora Jews at all, to help the Israelis to understand that to be a Jew is first and foremost to fight for human rights in the image of God. And I think this is Heschel's uniqueness there and today.
In the front, please.
Thank you very much. I think having you here is quite an opportunity because many of us have certainly followed your father, and many of us love your father so much. And he was so unique and special in terms of living his life, seeming to want to connect as deeply as possible with God. God in search of man, I don't know anyone else who has that kind of perspective. So you growing up with your father, this is an opportunity to ask you, what was your experience of your father in search of God? What did you experience growing up with this man who was in search of God? That's question number one. Question number two, when he talks about man, did you get a sense that he meant Jews? Or was he in fact more universal? And what might your father say now in terms of how non-Jews should be approached, namely Palestinians?
Mainly what?
Palestinians. Would your father have something to say about how Jews should be with Palestinians, or how God wants us to be with Palestinians? So I'm asked a lot of questions, so you'll answer whatever feels right for you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, let me just say that what I very much loved growing up was praying with my father. and being in the room in the morning when he was praying, or, yeah. And I think what was also important was the spirit that my father created. He was full of enthusiasm and energy, and he also, he was never moody or withdrawn. He was always very present and very alive, and also full of fun. And I didn't feel from him a sense of we're following rules, or, you know, sometimes people will say someone so-and-so is strictly Orthodox. We were Orthodox, but strictly isn't the word, lovingly Orthodox, let's say. It was all a fabric of life that was wonderful. But yes, at times when I said, you know, I'd love to go to hear him lecture, and then I would say to him, well, if it's so important, why can't I be part of it? Just because I'm a girl, you know? And my father was always said, yes, you're right, and things will change, and in fact, they have. So I loved his supportiveness of me. We had a lot of Christians who would come to our home who were warm and wonderful, and my father would, I remember he would put his hand on Bill Coffin. Reverend William Sloane Coffin was the chaplain at Yale, and it was Friday night, and he would try to teach him the Hebrew to make hamosi, the blessing over the bread, for example. I think my father felt that Judaism was a gift to the world. It was God's gift to everyone, and that his own life had been saved for a purpose, for a mission, to try to convey, what it means, what is Judaism. And so he felt an obligation to do that. And I also would finally just say that what I saw with him was also something I saw with my Hasidic family, which was gentleness, refinement, softness, kindness, compassion, sensitivity, human qualities that I think are remarkable. And my father never got angry. You know, you can't pray if you've been angry. And prayer was all the time. So he was never angry. And I appreciate that too about him. When you ask, my father said, the great dream that Israel has given the world is the dream of peace. That's in the Bible, that prophets dream of, nobody was dreaming of world peace. But that was also our gift. So how do we create peace? It doesn't just come, we have to work at it. And so yes, whatever could create peace, namely justice, my father certainly worked at that. And he sat down with people and talked to people and met with people. People that other people would say, oh, they're so radical or something. No, my father could find some connection. So yes, I think if he were alive, I'm sure he would try to speak to Palestinians about making peace, as well as to many other groups in this world. That's the kind of person he was. Well, thank you for your question.
Another question from the floor, perhaps. Yes, we have a question right here.
I apologize. I came in just a couple minutes late, so I don't know if you addressed this in the beginning, Professor Dror. But did Rabbi Heschel ever visit Israel, and did he write about his experience both with the people and its holy places in the land and reflect upon that, and how did it impact upon him, and did it have any long-lasting changes in his thinking?
Thank you, Rabbi Benji, and thank you for coming. I think the question is for Susanna, because she was there with her father in his visits in Israel. But I think that in his first visit in 1957, he was astonished from the young people in Israel, especially from the soldiers in the 50s. He discovered deep solidarity in Israel, and this is part of his decide to support Israel. And suddenly he looked back in the American communities, and he felt that something is missing here. He always lived with his background from East Europe, and suddenly he felt something of this experience in Israel, and it was important for him, the experience. Then he came time and again to visit the state of Israel, especially for the bat mitzvah of Susanna, and spoke in the house of the president, etc. But when he came in 1967, just after the war, he had another experience when he visited the Western Wall, and suddenly he felt that there is a chance for the state of Israel to fill the moral demand of God through the land. Unfortunately, the state of Israel went to another way, but after 1967, Heschel believed that the coming back to Jerusalem is an opportunity for interfaith peace between Muslims and Jews and Christians through Jerusalem, through the holiness of Jerusalem. And maybe it was too early, maybe today is also too early, but I think that Heschel's book, Israel, an Echo of Eternity, is a vision to the future. What the state of Israel can be. And this is my answer to your question.
I just had, my father, my mother, and I spent a couple of summers in Israel, in Jerusalem, of course, and it was wonderful. And my father had many friends there. When my father was growing up in Warsaw, one of his friends was the man who became Zalman Shazar, the president of Israel, who visited us once on a Friday night before he became president, and then invited my father to come for 2 months and give lectures, because Zalman Shazar was also concerned about young people in Israel needing some kind of rejuvenation spiritually and Jewishly. And so we did travel, and I would also just say, when you, when you mentioned the question of whether the rabbis' organization should join the Zionist, my father also said, let the Zionists join the rabbis' organization. So he was always turning things around in that way. But look, it was very clear to go to Israel, to spend a Shabbat in Jerusalem was one of the great experiences of a person's life. And for my father also, it was something very extraordinary, and I think kind of culmination of something and a real gift. My father said it should never be seen, Zionism or the state of Israel, as some kind of compensation for the Holocaust. Never. He said Auschwitz is in our veins. But state of Israel makes the Holocaust a little bit less unendurable. But he also said, sometimes with our indifference as human beings, it's as if our souls went up in flames with their bodies. So I think sometimes when my father doesn't mention the state of Israel, as in God in Search of Man, or Man is Not Alone, so on, doesn't mean it's not there. There are other things he doesn't mention, like the Holocaust. But some things imbue without being physically present. They're there in the back of the mind, implicit, suggested. You're thinking about it. Sometimes you can't say it, and I'm sure we've all had that experience. Hard to say certain things out loud, but we feel it. Our heart can be pounding, but we can't say it. So I think that's some of it. I think of what my father went through himself in the war, that his mother and 3 of his sisters were murdered, his whole family, the world in which he grew up. To be able to come out of that and to write with such passion and with such piety, with such spiritual sensitivity, that in itself I find extraordinary. And I do think that this is also a gift from God that my father was given to be able to inspire so many people religiously around the world of all different faiths. And that's a wonderful, that's a gift from my father. It's a gift from God. And my father was a gift from God for all of us. And I think we should take his words into our heart because it will lift us up.
Thank you very much for those words. I think this has been a very rich evening. Let's extend our appreciation to Dror Bondi and Susanna Heschel. Thank you to everyone who was on the live stream with us. Your presence also is appreciated. A special thanks to all of you in person. And we now have some refreshments in the back for you to enjoy as well. Undergraduates, please eat. Have a good evening, everyone.